So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending our January webinar. The topic for this month is Developer to Manager, a Survival Guide, and our speaker is Kat Kuhl from Adjust. So before I hand the mic over to Kat, I want to kind of cover some housekeeping things. Most of you all know who we are, but Drupal for Gov is a community and we love all things open source. We offer our Drupal GovCon, which we haven't had in person in a few years, possibly. We're working on that. And when we have more information, we'll share it with you. We also do global training days and half-day training. So hopefully we can bring that back in 2023. Gov Summit at DrupalCon America, North America, we organize and run that. And then we have our monthly webinars, which you are attending now. So if you are interested in speaking, have any questions, please reach out to us. We have an email, drupalforgov@gmail.com, and you can also reach us on Slack or Twitter. So if you're interested in hosting a half day or a multi-day, we're looking for space actually for our conference. Let us know, email us. We'd love to talk to you. And also we need people who can help us plan. So if you're interested in that as well, please email us at drupalforgov+host@gmail.com. So if you missed a webinar session, we always upload our videos to YouTube at the Drupal for Gov NP YouTube channel. And also I post links to all of the webinars at drupalforgov.us webinars. Our webinar for February is working with layout paragraphs and easy to use drag and drop content editing tool for Drupal, given by Justin Topin of 810 Design. So if you're interested in that, pencil that in for February, third Thursday. And last but definitely not least, I'm happy to introduce Kat Kuhl. If you've attended Drupal GovCon in the past, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, you may have seen her face. She was a web dev lead and has helped with organizing for Drupal for Gov. She's a speaker, a Drupal developer, and currently a Director of Backend Engineering at Adjust. So now I am going to hand it over to Kat. I'm tongue-tied.
Hey everybody, it's really nice to be back at a Drupal event. I have missed it for the past few years. So I'm just gonna share my screen quickly. Hopefully you all can see it. And as a bit of context, I put this talk together for new managers and people who are considering becoming new managers. We're gonna focus on the first challenges that you face when you make this leap and go from being just another member of the team to the team's leader. So first of all, a bit about me. As Nika mentioned, I'm the Senior Director of Backend Engineering at Adjust. And you can sporadically find me at WebbyCat on Twitter, as long as Twitter continues to exist. I've been working in the industry professionally for about 15 years, and I started out as a developer, then became a project manager, went back to being a developer, and at that point was working exclusively with, almost exclusively with Drupal. And then in 2014, I got promoted into a director role, leading tech teams at a US agency. Then after that, I worked in other director and VP roles at some US agencies, and then finally left the Drupal industry, sadly, and started working in product companies abroad. I now live in the UK and I manage a team of about 9 engineering teams, about 60 people in total. And so the people who report to me are engineering managers of various seniority levels. So the part I want to talk about today is that jump from managing, from being a developer to actually managing the people around you. And for me, this was when I went from into being the director of technology at an agency called Chief, previously called Rock Creek Strategic Marketing and now called U Group. I started out managing about 7 people and then was managing about 28 when I left 3 years later. So if you're moving into management, you might have a lot of feelings about it. I definitely did, which can range from really excited to some people to worried for others, or even just really wondering how you're going to handle it the first time you hear people talking about the boss. And remember, the boss is you. And some of us have more worries than others, because for my part, this is basically a dramatic reenactment of how I reacted when my boss told me they were moving me into the director role. I was so terrified, I nearly turned it down, and I knew it was a huge responsibility and really didn't know how to prepare. When you get promoted, especially if you're promoted to leading a team, you can feel like you're expected to have all the answers. And unfortunately, in a management role, you sort of are. New managers usually have really limited training, and whether or not you get instruction pretty much depends on whether your manager is the type who's going to sit you down and talk to you about giving tough performance feedback and figuring out the strengths and weaknesses of people on your team and how to start managing project delivery, or whether they're the kind of person who's going to say, I don't know, set up some one-on-ones and it'll probably be fine. So the training you get is really limited. The oversight you get is also usually pretty limited, because managers who kind of came up in roundabout ways themselves and might not necessarily be able to articulate the difference between a really good and really bad manager, they're not really that likely to check in with you about how you're doing, and they're even less likely to check in with your directs about how you're doing. But just because you've got the limited training and the limited oversight doesn't mean you have limited responsibility, because you are still expected by your manager to be able to speak for what's happening in your group, and your group is still expecting you to give them guidance. So most managers, in my experience, regardless of industry, seem to kind of learn with a crash course on the job. There are two main types of challenges that I often see people really struggle with. And the first one is communicating like a leader, even when it really changes your relationships. And the second one is shifting your focus from developing code to developing people. We're going to talk about both of these a bit today. So starting with communicating like a leader, up until this point, you've been a member of a team, and probably a pretty critical part of your team if you've been promoted into that role. You might have been mentoring people formally or informally even. But to be successful in a management role, you first have to accept that those relationships you have are really going to change. There is no magic bullet for getting the promotion and getting the raise and getting the responsibility and still relating to the people around you the same way that you do now, or at least if there is, I haven't found it. So the sooner you accept this and you start focusing on how you want the relationships with your team to work and what you want them to become, the better off you and your team will be. Say a little bit more about this. Basically, as a developer or even as a mentor, the relationships around you are based on collaboration. So you might be a front-end developer, for example, but you have a back-end developer that you're working with on projects, or you're working on an entire project by yourself, but there are a bunch of other projects that other developers work on, and you're all on pretty equal footing. When your colleagues don't do what you need them to do, the feedback you give them is likely to be pretty indirect. So rather than saying, hey, go do this, you're a lot more likely to say, have you tried doing it this way? Or, it would really help me out if you did this. Or I just saw this, I heard about this best practice that I think we could really try here. And if there's really a big conflict, you might go to the manager for support, but you're not going to be the person who's necessarily trying to deal with it one-on-one. And then finally, the process problems really belong to the manager, because even if you see major changes you can make, and don't get me wrong, developers can have amazing insight into how process problems can be fixed. Ultimately, you're not responsible for it. It's the manager who accepts your recommendation who's responsible for the impact. So all of this changes when you become a manager, because first of all, your relationships are now based on your authority, and everybody knows it. You now have the authority to approve or at least recommend raises, to approve or recommend promotions, and also in some cases to terminate people. And secondly, if you have an issue with someone's work, you need to be telling them firmly but empathetically, but very directly. And finally, the process problems are still manager issues, but now they're your problem. So because of all these changes, you need to find ways to communicate with your new direct reports, especially if they used to be your peers. The first thing that I tend to do to start changing this relationship is resetting it by sitting down one-on-one with each of the new direct reports and really talking about how you're going to work together. I call it a transitional one-on-one, and it kind of helps you turn subtext into text so that you can talk about the assumptions you both have about each other and get on solid footing. When I do these, I focus on 3 parts. One is getting their perspective on the team and the role. The second one is talking about our working relationship. And the third one is making room for wildcards. So first up, getting their perspective on the team and the role. If you've been on the team for a while yourself, you probably already have an idea of what it's like to work there and what the challenges are, but everyone's perspective is different. I recommend starting the one-on-one with this part, first, because it's like the least vulnerable, and secondly, because you can learn a lot about not only the person you're talking to, but also the team by doing this, even if you've been on it for a while. When you have this conversation with multiple people, you can start seeing trends and sometimes even realizing that something you might have thought as a positive actually has negative pieces of it. So I like to start out by talking about the work that they really enjoy and what's most challenging for them, and then lead into what I call the magic wand question. So basically, if you had a magic wand, what would you change? And sometimes people won't give you an honest answer right off the bat, but this is a good way of opening up the conversation for something a little bit deeper than what you're working on and making it clear that you aren't going to pretend you have all the answers and you want to hear from them, which is basically a big part of what people worry about with new managers. The questions are useful when you're stepping into a new management role in a team you know well, but they are critical when you're stepping into a role on a team with a company you've just joined. So when I joined one agency, the big ask that the C-suite had for me was helping to understand what was slowing the team down on some projects and then helping them deliver faster and more reliably. So by asking these questions to everybody on my team and also to their stakeholders, I could figure out what process problems were hurting them and then help fix them in more calculated ways rather than just throwing everything at the wall. So this can be really helpful when you're starting out. The second part is talking about your working relationship. Whether you're replacing a manager that people really didn't like, so they're a little bit worried about new managers, or you're replacing a manager that everybody loved, so they're kind of worried about whether you're going to measure up. Either way, the odds are that they're probably a bit nervous about what to expect from you, even if they like you as a person. So by asking them questions about what they liked about their previous manager and what they might really want to avoid, you're again giving them room to be honest with you about the kind of relationship they want to have with you. Excuse me. And you also get to learn a lot about their style. So most people will tell me that they hate being micromanaged, which is fair enough. And some people have told me that they don't like managers who are distant, that they want to really make sure that they can come bounce ideas off me and have a little bit more of a sounding board. Some people really couldn't care less about what's going on at the upper management level, and other people really want to make sure that I'm sharing their concerns upward and being really transparent about anything that I hear. When people tell you all of these preferences, you don't need to say, yeah, cool, I'll get right on that. And if someone is mainly saying that what they value about a manager is being promoted every 3 months, probably don't want to agree. But a lot of the times these requests are going to be really reasonable. And you can either start a conversation about something that you realize might be a pitfall before it becomes a pitfall, or you can tell them, I really get that and I'll do my best to honor it. So the last one, knowing what goals they're working toward, also helps you get the right perspective on what they want from their career and their timetable. I learned this the hard way because I started managing a developer who'd been in their role for about a year. And during his performance review, when it started, I found out that he'd expected to be promoted that cycle, and I had no idea. So it's way easier to salvage that if you're doing expectation setting up front and people know what to expect from you and you know what to expect from them, rather than if you're in a performance review with someone who's already disappointed and angry. So learn from my mistake and ask this question, even if you're starting to manage someone you already know. And of course, if you're thinking you already know the stuff about your team, you might be right, but you also might want to reconsider. I've done these one-on-ones even with people I'd previously managed at other companies, and there's consistently something about it that will surprise me because people's goals change over time, and so does their level of honesty. So I'd recommend chatting this through and maybe even revisiting it once a year once you settle in. The last piece is the wild card. I recommend making some room for people to tell you something off script. One person told me they had a new baby and they were really struggling with their hours, which was clearly hard for them because we just started having that management relationship. One person mentioned, for example, that they had appointments they needed to go to that sometimes were during work hours and they hoped it was okay. In other cases, people might be worried about working with you because of experiences you've had in the past. In short, like, open this question up and get settle in for a little bit of uncomfortable silence while they think about it, because the insights you can get out of it can really be worth it. And finally, write down these answers, because referring back to them will be helpful. Trust me, when you're thinking about you're doing a performance review a year in, or you're thinking about what really motivates them or what they really expect, you don't want to be racking your brain. It's way easier if you get to check your Google Doc. So this is an intro to transitional one-on-ones. And then we'll talk about the second technique for changing those relationships, which is learning to use multiple leadership styles. Again, even if it's your first management role, you've probably been doing some level of leadership within your team. Maybe you're leading projects, or maybe you are mentoring people. So you might have started evolving a specific style that works for you, like coaching people or showing them what to do so they can do it themselves, or getting smart people together to break down a complex problem together, or something else. Whatever style you naturally use, you're going to need to learn how to use more in your new role, because the kind of situations that managers face are really varied and really different from one to another. So one leadership style isn't enough to handle the different types of challenges. The styles that I'll cover here are from an article called Leadership That Gets Results by Daniel Goleman, and it's based on a study of it was about 4,000 executives chosen randomly and then all kind of interviewed about their management style, so patterns could be seen. And the 6 styles that he found were affiliative leadership. This is when you're really putting people first and focusing on building harmony and relationships across the team. Managers who over-rely on this style can have a hard time giving constructive feedback, but they also tend to build really loyal teams. Then there's authoritative, which might sound like it means authoritarian, but it's actually like talking about a vision, basically laying out a vision for your team and organization. And then after you've described what the organization needs, really rallying people to follow it. So this style doesn't work well if you're more inexperienced in the people that you're working with, but it works great in most other situations. Then there's coaching. This is a style where you're focused on developing individuals, and it works well when people are aware of their weaknesses and really want to improve, but it doesn't work well when they're resistant to change. Coercive leaders, as you might expect, lead through giving orders. They don't really encourage independence. They say what they want you to do and expect you to do it. So it's helpful when the company is in the middle of a crisis, but it can really squelch morale in most other situations. Democratic leaders involve the team in decision-making, which can lead to endless meetings and teams that feel kind of rudderless when used poorly, but it can really help with decision-making and flexibility when used wisely. And finally, pace-setting leaders are typically high performers who were promoted because of their technical competence, which is a really common pattern among developers and engineering managers. They set high standards and they expect people to follow them, and it works well with a self-directed team of experts, but it can backfire with less experienced employees. So part of the point here is that Goleman was arguing that people misjudge the power of leadership styles when they see it as a function of personality. So saying, I'm a coaching type leader, and that it's better when you see it as a strategic choice and you pick up whichever style is suited for the situation in front of them. He compared this to selecting the right golf club, but I don't golf, so I'm just not going to belabor that metaphor. And while many managers do lean on just one style, the best leaders can use these interchangeably when the situation calls for it. So a naturally democratic leader who's seeing the team get really rudderless can lay out a vision and get things back on track. Or a naturally coaching-oriented leader can come up with clear, directive feedback when they're having to put together, say, a performance improvement plan for someone who's just not responding well to coaching. So learning how to use multiple styles is basically a question of figuring out what comes easily to you and then doing the other part. And this is a conscious process of retraining your brain, and it takes a lot of time. So when I started managing people, I had 2 modes, and the first one was pace setting, where I basically expected that if I modeled the right behavior, then people would do it, and they would do it as well as I did. And the second one was what Goleman would call a coaching style, though different. Like, there's plenty of arguments about what a coaching style actually is. The result of my pace setting tendency was that I got pretty frustrated when people didn't tackle challenges the same way I did, especially if they got different results. And the result of my how about this soft coaching style was that I really struggled to give like direct constructive feedback. So to become a better manager, I had to get comfortable using democratic styles and coercive styles when needed. If you are also in that situation, these are some practical steps that I recommend to make this easier on yourself. First, assess the situation and think about what you instinctively want to do, and then really consider what it's going to do in the short term and the long term. So let's say that you're having quality issues on a team project, for example, and your natural instinct as a frustrated pace setter or maybe a frustrated coercive leader is to start personally reviewing everything that goes out the door to make sure that it's actually right. This might help you in the short term. People might actually, your projects might actually be higher quality in the short term. But in the long term, people now know that there's no real point in them checking their work really carefully because you're going to do it for them anyway. And secondly, they already know you don't trust them to be a professional because you're going to go do it for them anyway. So the situation you're going to be in a year is way worse than the one that you're in right now. You can then take time to reflect on how else you could approach it. I like doing this by writing it out personally. So you might think about how you might come up with team documentation and standards. You might think about the way that your code review process could change. You might consider peer review or like formal check-ins that people can do with each other rather than with you. You also might consider whether the problem stems from one particular person who might need a performance improvement plan, for example. As you come up with this plan, get feedback from people you trust. And of course, that can be your boss. Of course, that can be a mentor, but it can also be someone senior in your team whose opinion you really respect. Once you've refined this enough that you feel confident in it, you can run through the questions and reactions you might get when you present it so that you're more prepared for curveballs. So I personally have used this, especially when I was learning how to give better constructive feedback, by writing out scripts for the conversations I was going to have and what I thought would be hard about them. And then at times for really big ones, even role playing with a mentor. And this makes it a little bit more of a thoughtful experience. The third technique for communicating like a leader is really focusing on the big picture, both the big picture for your team and the big picture for each of your team members. For your team members, this is usually about how they can personally grow. It's really easy to lose sight of this when you're talking about projects and tickets. And let's face it, lots of one-on-ones wind up being about projects and tickets. So if your one-on-ones tend to be a bit transactional, I recommend having a one-on-one that you are formally setting aside to talk about their career, their goals, their objectives, their progress. And personally, I like doing these every 4 to 6 weeks, usually after we have the first performance review or the first collaborative goal setting. Secondly, really focusing in on what they're proud of accomplishing can also be helpful for tying it back to the big picture, because it's easy for people to talk to their boss about what they're struggling with or they need support with. But that also means that their bosses, in this case you, might not see what they're good at and what they're really excelling at quite as easily, depending on the person's communication style. So by talking with people about their successes, you can get more insight into what they're actually good at than just listening to what's frustrating them. And finally, I cannot stress this enough, if you see that they've got a ton of potential and they're ready for a next step, figure out how to support them. This might be giving them, at times it is giving them feedback about certain habits that can be holding them back, but really what I'm talking about more is advocating for opportunities, whether it's a promotion or whether it's working with someone outside your group on a problem that's outside of your group scope, but you think they'd be good at. Or it might mean setting them up to mentor other people on their team or even preparing them for a management role. It's great when people come to you and say that they want this, but lots of people don't. So keeping an eye on this kind of big picture as a manager will really help you with your team. The big picture for teams is a bit different because if you remember that I said that process problems are now manager problems, this means that while the developers on your team can have strong feelings about how the team does business, it's ultimately up to you to decide how that is. You have to have a vision for the way that you want your team to run. And I'm not saying you should have this on day one. In fact, it's really dangerous to walk in the door and think that you know exactly what the vision should be. But as you listen to your team members and you observe their work, you're probably going to start noticing a lot of factors that are either helping your team or holding it back. You'll also get more access to information about the company. So you might learn more about the profitability of your projects or the pressure that management's under or the long-term goals that your company leaders have. So you can support, protect, and grow your team by keeping this big picture in mind. Getting comfortable with conversations about what the team's doing well and what could be improved, or how what you're doing measures up to what your clients want. For example, do clients in your particular area need systems that are really big on flexibility at the expense of time, or do they need good enough applications fast? As your company's business model is changing, are you under increased pressure to deliver quickly? Do you need to learn new technologies to build out new offerings? Are you trying to compete for smaller clients or break into a bigger market? Basically, all this can be summed up with, where do you want to be in a year? Where do you want to be in 2 years? And if you let yourself get stuck on just the active projects that your team is working on right now, you won't see these trends until someone points them out to you. The last question that's really important to the big picture is how you as a leader are actually doing. And this can be holding up a high standard of performance for your team. It can be giving people room to succeed, managing the team's delivery. And unfortunately, you're probably not the right person to answer this question. So if you ask it casually, you probably won't get a very honest answer, because people don't love giving their bosses negative feedback because they've had bosses before. And for that matter, most bosses are uncomfortable getting negative feedback. Personally, I'm a perfectionist, so negative feedback gets burned into my brain. And when I started managing, I was actively avoiding it. And fortunately, I had a great mentor who encouraged me to, I'm paraphrasing, get over it. And this quote from the first 90 days really nails it. When you're doing something out of your comfort zone, you can either get brittle and fail, or you can learn and adapt. One of my toughest projects was in that first director role, and I was supervising 3 members of the team, and I was also leading the project that they were working on. And I'd been working really hard to keep that project on track, but there was a demanding client, there was loads of scope creep, loads of challenges, and the developers got really burned out. And even when we launched, their mood didn't improve. So I wound up steeling myself and sitting down with them to talk honestly about the project and just listening. At the time, we didn't have like a project retro process back then. And that conversation was not fun. A lot of their feedback was about the project, but some of it, expressed really respectfully and thoughtfully, was about me and some of the specific ways that I communicated about the challenges that we had. And it was really fair. I took notes, I avoided justification, and I worked my hardest not to repeat those mistakes from that moment forward. We continued working together really successfully, and I became more thoughtful about the team's needs in ways that I wouldn't have otherwise. So basically, I recommend getting this feedback regularly. At the end of a performance review is a good time to just get it. If there's not some big, terrible project you want to ask for feedback on, I usually wrap up performance reviews by saying feedback goes both ways. Is there anything about our relationship that you'd like to change? And I'll also ask if there's anything they want me to work on, just to make it more clear. And plenty of times, I'd say like 80% of times, people do say no, which is fine. It might be because there genuinely isn't, or it might be because, again, it's kind of hard to give that feedback to your boss. But extending that is really how you start to build the trust. And then not punishing them if they give you feedback you don't want to hear is another. So if people give you this feedback, just listen, don't get defensive, don't react. If you can, say you're going to take it away and think about it, and then really reflect about the feedback afterward, whether there are things that you want to take from it, or whether you really think that it's not fair, it's missing the whole situation. You don't have to tell them that. You can just decide not to act on it. Above all, just to point out the obvious, don't penalize people who tell you something you don't want to hear. Feedback is a gift, and if you punish people for it, you're basically guaranteeing you're never going to hear it again. So to recap, you can start communicating like a leader by setting up transitional one-on-ones to set the stage for the relationship, learning to use multiple leadership styles in multiple situations, and talking about the big picture. Next, we'll talk about how you can start developing people and not code. This challenge is a big one because developing people, they have way more variables and they are frankly buggy. But the good news is that if you have a certain kind of brain, seeing people grow over time is really satisfying. I feel like part of why this is a tough challenge is that you as a manager, you've been judged, well, as a developer, you've been judged on the quality of the solutions that you build. But as a manager, you're really judged on the quality of the team you develop. So the kind of metrics that you might have are, is my team delivering good work? Are they able to take on harder and more lucrative projects than they were a year ago? Are they growing as individual contributors? Are they sticking around? And these are really different from the metrics that you might use to evaluate a project. So if you're a pace setting leader, like I was, then you can fall into what I call the pace setting leader trap, where you start to believe that you know better than anyone else on your team, and you really hang on to work, especially if people don't do the things the same way that you do. So to get over this, you have to learn to delegate and to give constructive feedback. I think these are probably the two most important and also hardest challenges of being a manager. So we'll talk about them both here. If you have been promoted into a management role from a development one, it's pretty safe bet that you were good at what you did. You've probably gotten a pretty steady stream of praise for your aptitude at problem solving, and promotion into a leadership role is a recognition of the abilities that you're bringing to the table. But a lot of people who make this leap don't really get that their jobs have changed, and their jobs are no longer about their personal achievement, but about how they enable other people to achieve. So in other words, your scope expands. Rather than doing the front end work on a project while someone works on the back end, or rather than fully owning one project while other developers own other projects, you're now responsible for everything. And you might start getting in the driver's seat of the other tasks and projects you've picked up. You might think, I know this person's really struggling, and now that I'm responsible for his work, I'm just going to kind of step in and make sure this project gets done right, and then I'll evaluate it later. And there are a couple of reasons why you might get drawn into this trap. The first one is habit, because you're good at development and it's natural to keep doing the thing that you're good at. The second one is feeling like you demonstrate value by solving tricky problems. You might want your boss to see how much value you bring to the team as a developer and be able to take credit for how quickly and efficiently you work. You also might be afraid that if you give a task to your direct reports, they're just not going to do it right. I don't know about anyone else on the call, but in high school and college, I really hated group projects because there was always like someone coasting by. And there's something about managing a team that brings that feeling of, oh no, they're going to let me down, right back to the forefront. And finally, you might just really be trying not to overburden your team. You might be burning the midnight oil, trying to make sure that nobody else has to burn the midnight oil. It's a really nice thought, but it's no way to lead a team, because it ends with you asking yourself what a weekend is and what people usually do with their evenings. And based on a true story, why am I always still at work when the cleaning crew comes through the office? But it can be a tough habit to break out of. The main reasons that you should delegate are not even about your own well-being. They're really about your team's well-being. Because first, it helps everybody grow. The more they take on, the more that they know how to do. Secondly, it increases their job satisfaction to feel needed, because if they know they're only there because you can't be everywhere at once, and then you try to be everywhere you can, that sends a pretty clear message about how much they're valued. Generally speaking, if they're growing and they're satisfied at their jobs, they're more likely to stick around longer. And finally, this scales what your team can do. So rather than it being just what you can micromanage, they can act independently and take on more. These are all really good reasons to retrain your brain from I'll just take care of it to this would be a pretty great task for this person. And the trouble with this is that sometimes the people on your team are more junior than you are, and you need to find a way to give them room to take on challenging tasks without letting them completely fail. So this is personally what worked for me as a new manager. Delegating, we've been over this, and then setting milestones for check-ins. For some tasks, it might just be when it's done, and for others, it might be once they've gotten the requirements from the client or the PM, and then again, once the design is done, and then again, once they started development, and again at the end. Really, it depends on the cadence of your work, which you will really be able to judge. And then at these check-ins, listen to team members present what they've done and what they're struggling with. You can then correct the critical problems. If you see someone's about to walk off a cliff, metaphorically, you can tell them, whoa, hang on, look out. But you also don't have to correct everything they're doing. Like I say, critical problems for a reason. And you also don't have to answer every question they have. It's okay to say, how do you think we should handle this? Or even, what have you tried so far? Because oftentimes the people you work with know what to do and they're just not sure they know what to do. And in this way, you can help them be more independent over time. And finally, give credit, because if they're really knocking things out of the park, it's good for them to know that. And this bit of encouragement can go a long way. This process helps your team members hone their presenting and their critical thinking skills. And it helps you really understand where they're at instead of just jumping in and telling them what they should do or what you would do in their place. And critically, it still keeps you aware of how things are going, because again, you're still responsible for the team. So as you've worked with people longer and you started building up that trust, you don't need to keep the training wheels on. It's nice to be able to say, like, it's all good, I trust you, run with it and let me know how it goes. So in short, this is how I approach delegating. The second part, giving constructive feedback, is probably the hard one for a lot of people. Certainly it was for me. And what I wish I'd known on day one of that first director job is what a mentor would tell me about a year later, that being nice is not the same thing as being kind. As a fellow developer, you lack authority over the people around you. Not only is it not your job to tell them what to do, you can actually cause conflicts with them or with their manager if you overstep those bounds. But as a manager, it's the exact definition of your job. You are their first source of feedback about how they're doing. Again, you might have authority over when they get promoted. You might have authority over when they get terminated. And so in that context, shying away from giving them true, realistic feedback about their performance is the worst thing you can do, especially if you're still giving that feedback to the people above you. So in short, getting good at this is worthwhile. Making your feedback direct is really key. It's one of the most common pieces of management advice, and there are loads of resources on it, so I'm not going to linger here, but I am really happy to take questions about it during the Q&A at the end. There are two other criteria to keep in mind, and one is keeping it balanced. If you're telling someone that their work in one area has fallen below expectations, it's worth also encouraging them about the things they are doing really well. Similarly, and I actually see this problem a lot more frequently with new managers, if you're constantly telling them they're doing a great job, but then something's just kind of off and you can't trust them with some projects, it's worth sitting down to really think about, in addition to telling them how great they're doing at this, can I find constructive ways to set them on the right path about some of the other parts of their job description? Generally, I try to be just as careful about saying you're doing perfectly with no constructive feedback as I am to never say you're not doing anything right. And finally, make sure you're thoughtful about how you give feedback. Don't toss out proclamations about their performance off the cuff. Don't say things when you're too casual or you're not in the right headspace. For example, like, you might think it's okay to say, wow, your attitude has really gone downhill, and forget that attitude is a really loaded word, or not be able to come up with specific examples when they inevitably ask you for follow-up. So as I mentioned, some managers, including myself, like to mentally rehearse tough conversations before they have them. I used to, and still in some cases do, write out a loose script beforehand. And in short, if you struggle with knowing how to react in the moment, like, cool, you're new at this, and this can really help you a lot. A bit of preparation can help greatly. Above all, make sure you're taking out the guesswork, because if you've ever had a manager who didn't communicate well with you, this might resonate. Some managers manage to communicate that they're unhappy, but they don't really tell you what it is that they want. And this can leave the people around you feeling paranoid and like insecure, literally insecure in terms of job security, and wondering what to do. And your job is to make sure that your employees understand what the company and you need from them. By being direct, balanced, and thoughtful, you might not always be saying things they want to hear, but you can also make sure they understand what you want them to do next. And obviously, don't wait till review time to give feedback. It bears repeating, so I'm going to say it again. Don't wait until review time to give feedback. Let people know where they stand often and continually, and share positive and constructive feedback during your one-on-ones. If you've got a hard topic to talk about, you might be tempted to just leave it, but broach it thoughtfully during these conversations. Prepare for it in advance if you want to. Get some context and give some guidance. One of the advantages of this is that it takes the sting out of performance reviews because people are already used to hearing feedback from you. Plus, it means that you don't have a laundry list of problems they need to address at the same time they're gearing up to ask you for a raise. When it is time to put together a review, one of the really nice opportunities is getting to supplement your own feedback with feedback from other people who work with them. We do biannual reviews at my current company, and we have a 360-degree feedback process built into Workday, which is our HR tool. And when I'm reflecting on someone's performance, I usually start with my outline of their major accomplishments and then the things that I think they need to work on based on what I've observed. And then I send out these survey requests basically to ask the people that they work with. But back when I worked in an agency that didn't have tools like that, I just emailed people. And I'd email other developers they worked with, their project managers, their designers, depending on where they were. And I'd also email people that they might have been mentoring or they might have been getting mentored by. And I'd ask for a couple bullets or a few paragraphs about what they've done well and where there's room for improvement. No matter how you collect the feedback, whether it's from emails or Slack conversations, or I don't really recommend Slack conversations, or a HR tool, the important thing is to take it and review it critically. So if 4 people say that someone's only doing the bare minimum and 1 person says they're going above and beyond, there might be personal issues there. But if, as happened to me once, you've been telling one developer to really take a step back to avoid burnout and set more reasonable boundaries, and then the project manager comes to you to say that they're not working hard enough, there might be a perspective issue there. So the point is not to copy and paste all the feedback you get into the review, but rather to get good perspectives and then look at that kind of holistically. I've gotten really helpful feedback by doing this. I've found out that people I wasn't really impressed with were actually taking the load off the rest of their team in ways that I didn't see. And I've also found out that really good developers had pretty toxic communication with the people around them. So you can't be everywhere at once, and this is your opportunity to hear how all those tasks that you delegated actually went. I recommend putting positive feedback directly in the review. So if Bob says that Alice did a fantastic job on a project and her help was invaluable, quote it and cite him. Everyone I've ever managed loves this because it helps them see that their work is really valued beyond just me as their manager. And it should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway, that you never, ever, ever cite negative or constructive feedback, as in, if Bob points out something that's a really good point that Alice needs to work on, don't say Bob said you need to work on this in the review, because as the manager, all feedback comes from you. And you can evaluate it, make it constructive, put it in your own voice, and remind yourself that you're not telling her to work on something because Bob said she should. You're asking her to work on something because you think that it's beneficial for her. But all this feedback in a solid review format, if you've got an HR tool, it'll dictate it to you, but this is the one that I really like when I have freedom to start with positive accomplishments, then do goals that we set collaboratively, ideally before the review, things they should really start doing, for example, to prepare them for the next level, things that they should really stop doing, which is always corrective, and then again, closing on the positives of the great things they're doing that they can continue doing. So to recap, developing people, not code, starts with delegating and then gets refined by giving really constructive feedback in both reviews and one-on-ones. As you really practice these skills and hone them, you prepare yourself to take on bigger and more exciting challenges. Once you get a handle on them, I think management is a really rewarding place to be. So for example, you can start using the feedback loops, the relationships that you've formed, coupled with the deeper conversations to monitor morale. You can make changes when you need to, even big structural ones. So when I was at one of the agencies, we had a really, I want to say matrix, but that's not the right word. We had a style where each manager would manage people from different disciplines, and something really big went wrong with 2 people in the same discipline reporting to one manager. That manager took responsibility for it, came to me and afterward and was explaining, look, I'm managing too many different types of people and I can't stay on top of what all of them need to do. And it would really be easier if we could consolidate a bit. So I wound up looking at it and realizing that if we organized into functional areas, it would actually be a lot easier on the managers, and that would mean that the developers are getting better support. So we wound up doing that, and it paid off really nicely for the group. However, now at the workplace that I'm at, we're moving more toward cross-functional teams, which is a move in the opposite direction because that's what's right for this company and this work style. So there's no one right way to manage a team of developers or of anything else. But the more that you understand your team, the better you can make structural changes when you need to. Finally, you get to build a self-reinforcing team. This means getting people on board with your vision, getting a shared set of values, setting shared goals, having that right supportive structure. And these all help people at every level of your team work together to raise the quality of the work you do together, and not just position you to be endlessly trying to clean up other people's work, which isn't a good position for you or for them. So I'll leave you with this quote about what great managers do. They look for what is unique about each person, and then they capitalize on it. They realize their people are not uniform, they're not interchangeable. It's a lot more like playing chess than playing checkers. And over time, their clear communication, ability to use different leadership styles, ability to delegate, ability to really monitor performance can lead to great results. Personally, I believe that good management is the most rewarding work you can do. I wish everybody all the best as they pursue it. So thanks for your time and attention. If you like reading about this, I recommend these resources, most notably HBR's compendium of 10 great articles on managing people, which saved me when I was a new manager back in 2014. You can find me on WebbyCat at Twitter, and I would be happy to take questions now.
I love the quote that's in the chat. Mdad Ahmed posted. Apologies if I pronounced your name incorrectly, but it says, I love this quote from Nelson Mandela. It is better to lead from behind and to put others in front, especially when you celebrate victory, when nice things occur. You take the front line when there is danger, then people will appreciate your leadership.
I haven't heard that quote before, actually, and I love it. That's a really good one.
Does anybody else have questions? Feel free to come off of mute and speak.
Hi, Kat. This is Virginia.
Hello.
Really enjoyed the advice you've provided so far. I've been doing people management for a few years, but there's always new things to learn. Especially right now, I'm dealing with a difficult individual. So I'm wondering, yeah, that's, I think Shani kind of hit it on the head, like direct feedback.
Yeah.
That's a really good question. So I actually wrote a blog post on this a while back, going way into it. I would tend to recommend breaking it down in a couple of different ways. The first one is trying to be able to quantify for yourself what's really going wrong. Like by that, I don't mean psychoanalyzing what's going wrong. I mean, literally, when I was starting, I tended to have like thoughts more along the lines of their attitude isn't great. And then now it tends to be more, they have missed this many tickets in the sprint, or like the pushback that they've been having on major issues has been consistently affecting team morale, or they're having trouble working with people, but really quantifying what's going wrong and the impact that's having on the team without trying to guess at their motivations. The second part for me is trying to see how I might be contributing to the problem, which might be because I've been trying too hard to protect them, or that I've been kind of setting them up to fail. And then sometimes it's not you as a manager, but I'm paranoid about that, I guess. And then finding ways to go to them and talk about the specifics of what's going on. The kind of difference I see between telling them exactly what to do and giving this kind of feedback is that you can be telling them, this is the outcome I'm seeing. This is bad for the team for this reason. How do you think we can approach this? How do you want to handle it? What are you willing to do about it? Maybe not that last one, because that's a little bit loaded. And then trying to pull them along with you to problem solve. I've seen this work really well. I've also seen people need time to digest it. So sometimes having a two-part conversation where you talk about the stakes and then follow up on what comes next can be helpful. But I'm going to pause here to ask, is this what you're asking about? Or do you have a question about a different part of the process that I can speak to a little bit more specifically? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so far that's great. but specifically when it is a negative pattern in this direct report.
Do you mean, go ahead. Do you mean negative in the sense that you've repeatedly tried to talk to them about it and it's not getting any better? Or do you mean negative in the sense that it's a big negative behavior and you haven't yet talked to them about it?
I guess introducing it to them in a way that
Palatable.
yeah. Or not too unpalatable.
Yeah. So I'm thinking of a couple specific instances, some of them recent, some of them not. I tend to like to be able to connect it to the bigger picture for the team member. So for example, if I know that they really want to move up to the next rung of the ladder, for example, saying, look, I've been noticing a pattern in your behavior. I want to go ahead and talk to you about, might be a little bit of an awkward conversation, but I want to give you this feedback because I know how important continuing to grow in this way is to you. Or if that's not the case, but you're just seeing a slow fall and you're not really sure what's motivating it, saying, hey, this is really looks like it's getting to be a problem. I want to talk to you about it and understand what's going on for you a bit more, can also set it up. The one thing that I avoid doing at absolutely all costs is walking into a meeting with them that's going to be really focused on a problem and making friendly chat at the beginning. Saying up front, I want to talk about something kind of tough today. I want to make sure you know that I'm on your side and I really support you. And also, I really need to see this change, is usually how I would tee that up. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I hope it helps. I know there's not an easy way. And also, hi, I remember seeing you back in DC and it's been quite a while.
Yes, it has.
You have questions. I'm going to read the questions that are coming from the chat. So Shani Felder has asked, how do you advise providing direct feedback as a new manager without telling a team member exactly what to do?
I was trying, I heard Virginia mention that one, so I was trying to answer that one along with the previous one. But Shani, I'm really curious, is there something different that you were talking about or anything more that you'd like me to add?
Actually, thanks, Kat. I think you actually answered it in your first part to Virginia's question, also in your first part of your answer to Virginia's question. I like that you said, coming in, what is it that, actually explaining to your staff member that you're seeing a result. That to me is sort of a way of not saying, do A, B, and C and we'll be good. Actually getting the feedback from that person. This is what I'm saying happening based on, maybe some of the actions that are going on, and what are their thoughts on it? And then from there, actually saying, well, this may be a good thing or may not. But yeah, I think you covered it. Thanks.
One of the things, first of all, thank you. I'm glad that was helpful. One of the things I'd note is that with there's a fine line for when people are performing badly is also a loaded term, but you know what I mean, when their performance is going down from where you expect it to be. For some people, I've had the really direct conversation of, hey, this is a problem. I'm seeing these results. What's going on? And in a couple cases, I took people out to coffee and was like, hey, it feels like something's a little bit off. What's up with you? And not more like as in what's going on in your life. And they wound up kind of making it really clear that they understood the impact of their behavior. They were trying to change and they really weren't quite sure how to do it because they were going through something rough personally. So I think being able as a manager to gauge whether to come into that more saying, this is the result and I need you to clean it up, or to listen and say, I'm seeing something has really changed over the past few weeks and I'd love to talk about it. You can probably gauge when to do both, as long as you're making it clear from the outset that there is something going a bit wrong.
Yeah, that does make sense.
How I'm monologuing. I see MDAD's question, do you have any recommendations for natural leaders? And I would love to hear more what you mean by natural leader. Do you mean people who really kind of naturally take on that leadership position in a team but aren't yet in a management position? Or do you mean people who are in a management position and trying to take advantage of natural skills, or what?
Hey, Kat, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Awesome, thank you. Awesome session, by the way, before I kind of clarify that. My comment was regarding, I treat myself as a natural leader, developing, other developers as well too. And, I am looking to get into management. So do you have experience like working with those kind of people that like you kind of looked at them saying, okay, they are really good. They could be really good managers when they move up. Like kind of like things to watch out and kind of things to be look out for, if I happen to get to that position soon.
Oh boy. So that's a really good question. A couple things I have seen. It's a really fine line between taking on some additional responsibility to make your capability clear and also not working yourself into a hole. What I've seen consistently with people who are senior developers pushing into management or people who are new managers is that sometimes they can take on so much they go to burnout or they keep everything on their plate. And so that's obviously bad. But for example, keeping your eye out for an upcoming project that you could really help lead, or someone who you could help mentor and onboard. If you know that a new hire is coming into your department, for example, saying, hey, I'd really love to show them the ropes and have a check-in as they adjust and maybe have them shadow me on a project to get to understand it. That's a really good idea, especially if you have that seniority within your team. So generally speaking, I think people can make their readiness for the next level clear by either trying to help build other people up, for example, through mentorship, or by leading projects and being able to demonstrate that they can get results, or by trying to help improve team processes. So finding one of those areas, ideally agreeing with your boss on where you can make the most contribution, but going to your boss with ideas, those can help pave the way. Does that make sense? Oh, I see.
Yes, it does. Yes, thank you.
And then I see Lee's question about the mid-level manager blaming the first level manager. Oh, that's always fun. What advice can you provide to the first level manager from being the scapegoat? Leadership thinks the mid-level manager should be responsible. How do you tell your boss in a way you can accept? So to make sure that I've got this right, you're talking about a situation where something is going wrong with your team. The manager immediately above you is saying, it's your fault, you need to fix the situation. And the people above the mid-level manager are saying that they need to help fix the situation. Is that right? I'm going to assume it is, and please correct me if it's not. This really depends on your relationship with that manager and their ability to be self-aware. Oh, okay. And is the mid-level manager the person that is the boss that you need to tell in a way he can accept? They can accept? Sorry, I'm trying not to charge down the wrong path of the answer here. So in situations like this, I would tend to say that at the management level, people are got you. People are really good at throwing around blame, and playing politics becomes like a survival skill for managers in ways that it probably shouldn't be. What this can wind up meaning, yes, what this can wind up meaning is that sometimes being really direct about what you're seeing isn't always the best plan, especially when you're dealing with a boss who's not necessarily accepting it. Sometimes talking with your the mid-level manager in this case about the kinds of changes they want in the team, listening to that and saying, okay, I hear you, cool, I'll really think about that and go reflect on it, and then not doing anything with it can actually be a fairly decent strategy. If your leadership isn't feeling like they're going to confront the situation with a mid-level manager head on, then really trying to sit down with them and brainstorm what it is that they want from the team and from you can be a good way to mend fences and push forward together. I would love to tell you that you can just phrase it in a way where the mid-level manager can realize they're wrong, but that basically never happens. The only way I've seen situations like that turn around is if they can is if everyone can feel like it's kind of their idea to work together. Does that make sense? Yeah, I would not. In that situation, Leah, I would really tend to think about if the situation is toxic enough that things are being said about the team, you can't talk to leadership, and you do feel like mid-level can't say, can be saying whatever they want, you can look for other options, but I would still try to bury the hatchet with the mid-level manager if you can, and try to talk about what they want from you. It's not a very satisfying answer, but it's usually one of the only choices. I know everybody's got to drop. I didn't expect to be running overtime, but we are. You're also welcome to find me on Twitter, and I'm happy to chat more there. And Shani, I would love to talk about overcoming imposter syndrome, so please do feel free to reach out.
I know that's such a good question, because I feel
Thanks,
like so
Kat.
many of us suffer from that.
I do recall Kat used to do a whole presentation on imposter syndrome with
Indeed.
Heather and Sarah, if I recall
That is
correctly.
right. Yeah.
Maybe we can have the three of you back to do that. Just saying, the three of
I
you
would
could
love that.
probably get back together and do that.
That would be really fun.
That'd be
Thank
great.
you all.
Thanks, Kat. This is great.
Yeah, it was really great to see all of you. Thank you guys for the great questions. Thank you folks for the great questions.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kat, especially. And see everybody again in February.
Thank you.
February. Bye.
Sounds good.
Bye.